Welcome to the committee and members of the public who are perhaps watching us on livecast. For those who are watching on the webcast or Twitter, please use London Assembly or Assembly Environment or Embodied Carbon as your hashtags. And can I remind members, guests and anyone in the audience to turn their phones off or put them onto silent, please. Do we have any apologies for this meeting?
Thank you, Chair. Apologies for absence have been received from Assembly Member Curtin and Assembly Member Bailey. Apologies for absence have also been received from Assembly Member Sahota and Assembly Member Arnold, for whom Assembly Member Gavron and Assembly Member Desai are substituting. We've also got apologies for lateness from Assembly Member Cooper and Assembly Member Gavron, who Assembly Member Shah will be substituting.
Thank you, and thank you to those Assembly members who are substituting today and making us quorate. If we can note under declarations of interest, if we can note the list of offices on the report, and are there any other additional interests to be declared? Nothing? Thank you very much. If we can confirm the minutes of the meeting of the committee held on the 14th of June 2018, which will be signed by me as chair as a correct record. Thank you very much. And can I ask the committee to note the list of completed and outstanding actions from previous meetings? Thank you. Understanding Order 1.12, I will now take agenda items 6, 7 and then 5. So agenda item 6, which is... sorry, are you pointing something out to me? No? Can I ask the committee to note the response from the Mayor to its report, Wasting London's Future, as attached at Appendix 1 to the report, and the review of the impact of the report attached at Appendix 2? Let me note that. Thank you. Item 7, is that right? Next? Yes, thank you. That now brings us to today's first item for discussion on the progress made on embodied carbon. Our guests are Simon Sturgis, who is the founder of Sturgis Carbon Profiling. Welcome. Then we have Anne-Marie Robinson, who is a Senior Policy and Programmes Officer at the GLA. Welcome. Then we have Rhian Williams, who is a Senior Strategic Planner at the GLA. Also welcome. And then we have Julia Godefroy, who is Head of Sustainability Development at the Chartered Institute for Building Services Engineers. Thank you very much for being here. We then have Robbie Epsom, who is a sustainability consultant from WSP. Welcome. And we have Jane Wakiawaka, who is the Sustainability Manager for the Crown Estate. Welcome to everyone. And I'm going to start things off by asking a very simple question, which is, what is embodied carbon and why is it significant? And I think this is incredibly interesting, but I gather that we need to work hard to make sure that people understand the interest in embodied carbon. So perhaps I could start with Simon.
Right, so embodied carbon is the emissions associated with the building of buildings, in essence, and maintaining them. So it covers the carbon impacts or the carbon emissions associated from sourcing materials, transporting those materials to manufacturing plant, manufacturing them into products, transporting them to a fabrication plant, transporting them to site, and then building a building. And then, so it's all those emissions associated with getting you to a point where the building is now complete. But also, it includes the emissions associated with repair, maintenance, and so on. And ultimately, it includes the emissions associated with demolition, deconstruction, and disposal of the building. So it is all basically material-related emissions, as opposed to what we describe as operational emissions, which is the day-to-day energy use.
Thank you. And can I ask, I know more about transport than house building, but the sector is being asked to reduce emissions by how much in order to meet the government's commitment to the Paris Climate Agreement?
Well, overall, as a country, we have to reduce by, I think it's 90% between, I'm going to get the timings right, but between 80% between 1990 and 2050. Now, at the moment, if you look at sort of any sort of diagrams on this, the focus for the built environment tends to be on the energy use that buildings use, the day-to-day energy use. I'm sure Julie will come in on this if I'm getting this wrong, but it's really covers that. So, but also in terms of reducing the meeting our obligations of that 80% reduction, it also covers industry and as you say, transport. It includes waste and so on. So all the aspects that are to do with running an economy, if you like, a lot of those go into producing the materials. So although the emissions are out there, in the sense that they are being covered in other areas, it is really to do with demand, and it is to do with incentivizing demand, if you like. So when people are building buildings, they need to be, in my view, incentivized and encouraged to demand or require lower carbon emissions. So it might be choosing low carbon materials, it might be choosing longer life and more durable materials, for example. And if you're building houses, it'll cover all of those aspects. So it is looking to really improve, I think, and I think another important point here is to do with cost. I think typically choosing lower carbon materials is synonymous, and I'm not saying always, but is typically synonymous with reducing costs of construction.
With reducing
cost.
So there is an incentive.
So there is an incentive, but I think against that you've got entrenched views and all sorts of other things. So really there needs to be incentives, and I think we'll come to it, I'm sure. But the latest draft of the London Plan, including whole life carbon, and it's probably, should I mention?
I think we'll be coming on to the London Plan sort of later in the meeting. Yeah. So thank you. Is there anyone else who would like, particularly our three guests on at this end of the row, would like to say anything else on just that introductory question of what is embodied carbon and why is it significant?
If I could just add, I think that it's true that the UK's carbon policies have tended in headlines to focus on operational carbon. However, what I would like to point out is that there are many policies and regulations and incentives that are not labelled as directly carbon related, but which are. So, for example, policies to reduce waste, a lot of carbon emission directives coming from the EU translated in the UK on industrial emissions. They are meant to incentivize more efficient manufacture of products, etc. So it's just a caveat, I think, and that also leads me to say that there's the embodied carbon of the material itself, and then very importantly how it ends up in the building. So it's also the process of getting there. Not only the material. I know it sounds pedantic, but there is, for example, so much waste that you might choose low carbon material and actually end up with a high carbon building because
you've wasted it, you mean during the construction process? Yes. Thank you. Robbie, did you want to add?
I suppose I could add to that as well. I think an important point to make with embodied carbon is it's about where you draw the boundary, so I guess the scope. So I mean, what Simon described as the embodied carbon for a building. So I guess in that sense you think of the building as the product. So your life cycles stretch across the building itself. But a lot of us look at embodied carbon at product level as well. So you could be looking at a ton of steel or a ton of concrete. And it's quite an important point to make because it very much changes the conversation. So if you're dealing with a ton of steel, you tend to be talking to the manufacturers about how they make their steel. And you're looking at the operational carbon that goes into making that ton, which then ultimately becomes the part of the procurement process for the building. So I think that's quite important because when you're talking about buildings, you're dealing with the designers, the developers, and the conversation is slightly different. But when you're talking about products, you're dealing with manufacturers. I think there are different opportunities in terms of what you can do. I think with a building, there's a lot you can do around embodied carbon, but equally it does fall on the people who manufacture the original goods that you're getting to be able to have that impact. So I think it's also important to make because it creates that dialogue between those sort of two parties.
Thank you. And Jane, did you want to add anything? Just
I mean, I think the panelists have covered it very well, but I think in terms of the significance, if you're looking at the whole life carbon of a building, embodied carbon probably embodies up to 30 to 50% of that building life cycle. So the importance is to look at it kind of on a holistic level.
Thank you. Thank you. And do we know which stages of the building life cycle are sort of most carbon heavy?
Shall I try that one?
Yes, please.
If you take it varies depending on the building type,
Mm-hmm.
but clearly the construction phase up to the point of practical completion is probably the bit. So it's building the building is a major carbon cost. But also, I think the important point is it's probably the most, once you've built the building, you should know what it's made of, and therefore you should be able to assess fairly accurately the carbon cost of having made that building. From that point onwards, during the life of the building, you've obviously got day-to-day energy use, but you've also got repair and maintenance, and both of those are not as accurate to predict because things change and so on. But I think it's fair to say that, and it's certainly something we've looked at quite carefully, that with new buildings, the material costs over the life of the building, as Jane has said, tend to be in excess of about 50% of the total picture. Now, it's quite a complex series of interconnecting things that happen there, but it is not an insignificant part, is what I'm really saying. Whatever percentage you finally settle on, it is a major part of it. And I think the issue has been is that over the years, the effectiveness of things like BREEAM and Part L and other regulations and standards has been to bring down the operational energy use to the point where now embodied has become kind of, if you like, the elephant in the room.
And you think embodied carbon is the elephant in the room in terms of the carbon emissions or carbon impact of construction?
Yes, I think it's something that can be readily addressed by people building buildings, so developers, housing or whatever, office, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And it is something that also, the other point is that the emissions are being saved now rather than potential savings over the life of the building, if you like. So if you're looking at the embodied up to the practical completion, the construction of the building, those are savings you can achieve now. And of course, every ton of carbon that goes into the atmosphere, the sooner you save it, the better, if you see what I'm saying.
Yes, thank you. Anyone else want to come in on that one?
Yes, if I could add to that, I would certainly agree that it's not an insignificant part. I think it does really very much vary with the building type, both in terms of the end use and the construction type. So simplistically, between residential and a high-end, cooled, ventilated office, again, simplistically, there will be big differences between a Victorian house that has been there for over 100 years and a high-rise building which may not actually be that floor efficient, etc. So I think 50% is sometimes used as estimate, but on some building types, I have also seen figures of 15, 20%. And I think this is one of the complications at the moment, is that there is not that much data on that many building types for the industry to be able to give accurate benchmarks and estimates. So I think we need to be a little careful about the figures that are available at the moment. There's not that much data.
Is there work going on anywhere to get better data?
The GLA. So the draft London plan would be a great start, and obviously the RICS methodology that I'm sure we'll come to.
Yeah, I mean, the RICS methodology, which I was co-author of, sets, I think one of the key problems, as Julie's correctly pointed out, was that there were, although the same standard, people working to the same British standard, EN 15978, people are interpreting in all sorts of ways. So, of course, that discredited the whole idea of embodied carbon. But I think it's fair to say that since this has been produced, it's given a common methodology for people to refer to. Now, from that, it's meant that also it happens to overlap with BREEAM 2018, so not 100%, but pretty closely. So there is alignment. And I think also we're finding that increasingly the industry is taking account of this. So, for example, I've just been going around the Sterling Prize finalists, and most of those had taken in, an embodied whole life carbon assessment, whether it was crude or not. And so, if at the top of the industry, if you like, people are looking at those sort of things, it'll filter down.
Thank you. Now, you described embodied carbon as, the elephant in the room when it comes to carbon emissions. Are there, from construction, are there stages where there are some quick wins, where it will be easier to bring down the embodied carbon? Are some stages of the construction process easier than others to get those savings?
I think the obvious sort of first wins are things like structure. It's the big component. So structure is typically a good one to work on. And services. But the interesting thing about things like services and the external walling, the cladding of a building, is that whilst they may have relatively small carbon cost to make, so if you're putting in, say, boilers or central plant of any sort, the carbon cost of those is a certain amount, which is not necessarily huge at the outset. But because you replace these things on a regular basis through the life of a building, they add up. So in aggregate, they build up, and they can be more than, say, something like the structure, which at the day one was the biggest single item. So if you're starting off, yes, you want to work on the structure, but you also want to think about the life cycle of the building. So you want to think about the life of the building. So, for example, buildings that are naturally ventilated, first of all, don't have a capital carbon cost, apart from a financial carbon cost, of the plant in the same way that a regularly air-conditioned building would be, but they also don't have replacement costs as well, in carbon terms.
Yep.
I make a really quick
Robbie,
point.
please.
Just going back to your last question on the elephant in the room, sort of question for embodied carbon. I think an important point to make is that embodied carbon's relationship with operational carbon, which is another key thing, fluctuates. And a big part of that is the decarbonisation of the grid. So as embodied carbon improves, and we look at things like modular design and a lot of the circular economy actions that you hear banded about, there will be a sort of improvement in sort of embodied carbon versus operational, i.e. operational will be the worst maybe of the two. But then as the grid decarbonises, embodied again becomes the issue. And I think it's probably fair to say, I don't know if the rest of the panel agrees, that we are definitely trending with the grid decarbonising like it is to embodied being a much more significant part of the life cycle. And the other point you asked about any sort of action I think that was being taken on embodied carbon. Sweden are actually looking at being carbon or climate neutral by 2045. And WSP has actually been working with them to develop their roadmap for the construction sector. So there are people taking positive actions at sort of country level, so there's no reason why we couldn't do that, and that takes into account a lot of the sort of easy, low-hanging fruit that Simon just mentioned.
Thank you. Yes, Julie.
I don't know if there are easier steps, but there are certainly, I think, measures that are no regrets that a lot of project teams could focus on. And in particular, I'm thinking about construction waste. Now, that is not necessarily that easy because it does rely sometimes on supply chain and contractor arrangements, but there definitely would be benefits in costs and a host of environmental issues, not only carbon. And the other are measures that benefit both embodied and operational carbon. So, for example, passive design strategies that allow the building to need less energy in use, but also reducing or even taking plant out. So you have saved embodied carbon as well. And there are really, once project teams start thinking about it, there are lots of opportunities there that I think are really interesting, and they avoid what can be very difficult sometimes, which is to weigh one measure against another. So for example, should I have more insulation or not? What is better in terms of embodied and operational carbon? I think win-wins or no regrets or some catchy title would be what to focus on.
Great. Does anyone else want to come in on that?
Yes, I absolutely agree with that. I think just give one sort of microcosm, a sort of example. If you put in insulation into a building, you obviously improve the operational day-to-day use. The more insulation you put in, the better it gets. But the interesting thing is that the current regulations don't distinguish between the different sorts of insulation you might be putting in. So you might be putting an insulation in which has quite a high carbon cost to make, whereas really what you should be incentivizing is not only putting in insulation, but putting in something that is a low carbon cost, because there's no, as we all know, there's no free lunch, so putting in insulation costs carbon as well as saving carbon, and it's really getting the optimization between those two things, as was said a bit earlier. The relationship between embodied and operational wants to be optimized so they both work in the best possible way.
And presumably, you're going to get the best results if you're looking at that whole life cycle at the design stage.
Absolutely.
And what are the barriers to that happening at the design stage at the moment?
Education, information, and I'm trying to think of a third one, but basically that sort of thing. It is to do with information and I suppose regulation probably.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay, we're now going to move on. Oh, sorry. Yes,
question. Sorry, before I ask the two questions that I have, I just want to clarify what the two sets of figures that have been given to us. And forgive my ignorance, but this is a rather technical area, and I'm serving for another member of this committee. But you mentioned a figure of Ms. Wakiawaka, 50%, and I think, Julie, you mentioned 15 to 20%. Is that within, can you just clarify the context in which you quoted those figures?
So I've seen they're basically a range of studies on the proportion that embodied carbon represents in a whole building.
Right, within a building, fine. Yeah. And your 50%, what was it?
So my statistic was basically saying, and it does reflect what Julie said, is that it can be up to 50%, so it does vary significantly.
That was my understanding, but I just want to be sure and not look silly. So in terms of London-wide, what percentage of London's carbon emissions is represented by embodied carbon?
It's a very difficult question to answer, because I think, although I don't believe infrastructure is the topic of today's meeting on embodied carbon, but infrastructure is very different from buildings. You take something like Tideway with pumps running for a 120-year design life. Embodied carbon gets quite significantly skewed for a project like that versus a two-bedroom flat with a combi boiler and some LED lights. So it's a very difficult question to answer. I think with every sort of situation, it's going to be down to looking at even just looking at buildings. Is it a warehouse? Is it a flat? Is it a multi-tenancy or multi-occupancy office block? Is it old? Is it new? And I think to come up with a single figure would be too difficult. I think that's my opinion.
If I can add to that, I think there's two things. One is in the BRICS professional statement on whole life carbon, there's some diagrams which give some proportions of that for new buildings, and they make allowances for operational energy use, both regulated and also unregulated, which I know is an area where it's often underestimated. But for new buildings is one thing, but of course, if you're asking about London as a whole, most energy used by London buildings will be buildings that obviously exist as opposed to being built, and therefore the overall amount of embodied emissions in London as a whole would be restricted to new buildings. So that means it would be a relatively small percentage, because if we're talking about saving energy across the entire housing, for example, that's going to be all those existing houses. So it's all going to be about operational energy, and it's going to be about what you do with existing buildings, which I know is on the agenda. So that's a very important area. But in terms of new buildings, that's really where the embodied savings come in.
Just to put this formally to you, Mr. Sturgis, I think you already touched upon this, but again, a very general question. How much of a barrier is embodied carbon to the mayor achieving his zero carbon city by 2050?
How much the embodied carbon?
How much is embodied carbon a barrier to the mayor achieving his zero carbon city by the 2050 target?
That is,
That's a general question. So.
Yeah, that's a
question for Rhian and Anne-Marie.
That's a very big question. I think, I mean, then it raises the issue, is it possible to get to a truly zero carbon building? Because if you're building a building, it has emissions whether you like it or not, and therefore to get it to zero is problematic, clearly, unless you're offsetting. So to get to zero carbon or you know, carbon neutrality by, say, 2050 is going to be a big ask, certainly if we're building new buildings. It's a very difficult question. You know, it's a big question. As somebody else.
I think it's a question of payback period. I think if we were to sort of put carbon to one side and think of it in terms of cost, it's capital cost. So if you invest in some solar PV on your house and it costs you X amount, how many years you have to wait before you've sort of benefited from that original investment? And it's the same with carbon. If you build a new building, you know, how many years is it going to take before the embodied carbon gets sort of paid off by the savings in the operational? So there will be a point where it does start to become carbon zero, I guess, once it's sort of net positive. That's the right sort of term. But it would require some type of offsetting. I mean, you know, a great future would be maybe having buildings that are like sort of mini energy generating facilities which are sort of constantly offsetting to the grid. But I think it would take something like that because, just like Simon said, there's a capital burden to building a new structure.
No, Anne-Marie, did you want to just comment on the question about meeting the Mayor's target?
I mean, I think a big part of this is being able to capture the data on these types of emissions. We are looking into being able to capture sort of what we call the Scope 3 emissions for London. So this isn't just the embodied emissions from buildings and transport, but also those associated with the products and services that Londoners consume from the food and drinks industry, that kind of thing. So there is the work going on around this bigger sort of picture. But I think the issue is that there's a lot of data lacking at the moment, which we're trying to build information on so we can at least track those emissions, which I think the Mayor has less influence over compared to more direct emissions. But we still agree that it's important to at least monitor them so we can make sure that they are remaining stable and doing what we can to reduce them.
Thank you. We're going to move on now, and Navin is going to take up on looking at the product stage and the recycling aspects of the end-of-life stage of buildings. Well, after that, we'll be looking at the construction stage and demolition and waste disposal aspects.
Yeah, I mean, already, thank you, Chair. Already, Simon, you kind of talked about the building process, structural elements, you know, what part they play, you know, external cladding, etc., envelope you mentioned, and obviously the building regs, BREEAM, what that contributes and so on. Julie's talked about building types and so on. So, homing on to questions on both building products as well as building form, I've got specific questions. The opening question is, how can London reduce the carbon embodied in its building materials? You want to start, Simon?
I think there are various things that could be done. I think one way to deal with this would be to set a sort of a per meter carbon cost for different building types. Now, that could be set so that if you do better than the threshold, so let's say it's housing, and you're saying that to build a reasonably low carbon house in terms of construction is, let's say, 800 kilograms of CO2 per meter squared. What you could do is incentivize people to reduce below that, in which case they get a credit against the Section 106, say. Mm-hmm. In which case that would start to sort of get the, but you'd have, where you set it would have to be something to be, you know, decided and discussed, but that would set a kind of overall thing. I think otherwise, I think it's a question of shifting. It is a balance, because on the one hand you want low carbon materials, but on the other hand you don't want short life, in my view, because you're investing in buildings, you don't want them to last no time at all. And so it is a question of the designer balancing out these things. I think there are certain things to do with choice of materials. I mean, clearly timber is sort of obviously good, but it's only good if it's treated in the, if it's handled in the correct way. Brick will take a lot of energy to make, but then it'll last you 2,000 years if you want it to. So I think it is about incentivizing the process and encouraging people to get sort of the overall pot, if you like, down, because that in itself will then reduce the individual components, i.e. the bits and pieces that go up to make a building. So I would try in the simplest way, it's rather like setting a U value or something, you set a level and you get credits, as I say, below that. You might have to compensate financially by increasing the cost if you don't reach the threshold. So in other words, you're sort of effectively taxing, if you like, the lack of meeting the embodied carbon level. But it's otherwise, I think it's to do with education and encouraging people on where to look on better materials. I mean, I think a very simple example is that something like powder with aluminium on the outside of a building, if you anodize it, which is the shiny finish, you need to have virgin aluminium because you have to have consistency of the aluminium color to make anodizing work. If, on the other hand, you use powder coating, which is basically a paint, then you can use recycled content in your aluminium, which in turn will bring down the carbon cost, improve circularity and recycling and so on. So at the moment, for many architects, and I'm an architect, the choice is one about colour and maybe cost, but it's not about carbon yet. And I think those sort of things, to people to understand the implications. So it is education. Architects and other building designers and design teams need to really understand in the fullest possible sense about their materials.
Do you think they do within architectural
not
construction
enough,
industry?
No, not enough. And it applies to things like ethical and responsible sourcing. It's the same basic issue. Architects need to know, and engineers and so on need to know much more about the materials that we specify.
I'm an architect, and certainly I would admit that that was never sort of ever on the agenda pretty much.
No.
Leave alone top of the agenda. Because obviously, whatever we say, glass, aluminium, steel are going to be there for all forms of buildings, I reckon. It's a question of, how you can make them more carbon efficient in the sense. This is something which has been lacking in training and in the whole kind of workings of how professionals take on board building specification as well as forms as such.
Well, your question is exactly about better building, because inherent in it is to do with longer life, more durable construction, more durable materials, and not, be cynical slightly, taking the photographs at the end of the project and moving on to the next one. You need to, at design stage, really know about the life of your building.
Do you want, Julie?
Yes, so I absolutely agree about the importance of education and raising awareness of the importance of the issue and of measures that can be done about it. I, however, really do not think that now we are at the stage where there could be a target set for many reasons that we have mentioned earlier. For example, all the different building types and building end uses and project circumstances, etc. Particularly if that target was linked to a tax, I could foresee a lot of issues, pushback, loopholes, etc. Raising awareness, absolutely. There are also existing mechanisms teams could use much more. For example, systematically asking information from their supply chain, using environmental product declarations. Another difficulty with setting a target is that actually there is very little information, particularly in building services, and very often actually cost is used as a proxy. So you could see how difficult it would be to set a target. An intermediate way may be that, for example, project teams could be required to disclose, to calculate, to disclose the information And I think that, particularly in the microcosm of London, is quite powerful, because even without a set target, the leading consultants and the leading developers check each other's work, and you gradually improve the industry, but without, at the moment, the uncertainties of a target. That's...
I obviously would disagree. I mean, there is data, sufficient data, I think, to set targets, but in fact, the actual target is not so important, because it is about generating a trajectory for what people, for behaviour. And the level of the target is probably less important than the existence of a target. If the target is not that demanding, then it means that people get benefit against Section 106 too early. If you make it quite demanding, really quite demanding, it will nevertheless generate a situation where people will drive towards it. So if it is quite demanding, that is fine, because it means that people still have to work towards it. But at the same time, as I say, it's about behaviour. And I think the point about encouraging education, if I can put it like that, I think if you use it as a vehicle to change behaviour, and of course these things can be moved. I mean, any target, BREEAM ratings, for example, get moved along. All of these things evolve. But I think even setting a fairly basic targets or series of targets to start with would be a good thing to, as I say, change behaviour.
Could the building regs, to everyone, could the building regs, for example, which, set the building standards as such and, code of practice and all of that, can they actually be more specific, more to sort of to require building products to be more carbon efficient, for that matter? Because I do accept that incentives, you might call it, rather than targets. You mentioned Section 106, it could be community infrastructure levy as well, which can actually generate the sort of better quality in this sense. But surely I think that there may be some room for building regs to take on board in greater detail and other provisions, so that we get more carbon efficient buildings.
Yeah, I mean, I think at this point in time, interestingly, the latest version of the London Plan, just by asking for whole life carbon and embodied carbon, is already creating, an incentive, if you like, for people to engage, and that's a great start in my view.
Okay, can we go on to the actual? I mean, you mentioned, Simon. You mentioned timber. You mentioned bricks. You mentioned aluminium in whatever form. Are there what are the other carbon efficient materials that could be are there, and how can they substitute more carbon intensive materials? Julie, do you want to come in first? Or Robbie?
Sorry, I'm building up with quite a few.
It's carbon intensive versus, yeah.
So I think just one really quick point. I'm a process engineer, so products is a big part of what we do, and embodied carbon spans all sectors. Pen's got embodied carbon in it, the glass, construction products. Some of the best action in terms of reduction in embodied carbon is in the construction sector. And the interesting thing is that most of it is market driven by things like BREEAM, LEED version 4. And it's not just about selecting efficient materials. Sometimes it's about working with the manufacturers, going back to the point I said earlier, to make existing products more efficient. And a big part of that is doing things like environmental product declarations, and they're more and more being asked for and have been used in a lot of things which we work with, tools, software. HS2 use them to assess their infrastructure project. And it's incredible what can be done compared to business as usual when you actually work with these companies to just start thinking about how they can make their products more efficient. So I think it's quite a few different things. It's about working with the existing materials and their manufacturers to make things more efficient. It's about working with the designers, going back to the education piece, to make sure better construction processes, but also new innovative products are selected. And this is kind of a key thing for WSP. We're very keen, whilst measurement's really important, on the sort of practical action side of things. What do we actually do to improve this once we know that it's a problem? And one thing we've done actually is publish a set of 10 recommendations on circular economy and sort of practical ideas and actions for what could be done to reduce embodied carbon and other embodied environmental impacts. And circular economy principles are great because they're all about things like modular design, reuse, design for demolition, all these sorts of things. And some of the key things which we've sort of put forward goes back to exactly what I think several other panel members have mentioned, which is these sorts of principles need to be embedded into architecture, engineering, design, all these degrees, so that when they get out there and they start designing buildings, putting in processes to make tons of steel, concrete, whatever it might be, they are designing, the sort of next generation of designers are doing this with all these best practice and principles in mind, because they do exist. I've seen some incredible improvements. It's just about getting it to be business as usual. Another big one, just to pull a few examples, is the waste regulations. Construction waste, excavated material is still defined as a waste. If we could define it as a resource, it becomes a product that could serve other projects across London. So we've got 10 great practical recommendations under the banner of circular economy, but there is a lot that can be done. And environmental product declarations seem like quite a good vehicle for helping to communicate that and catalyse the market.
If I could add two things that might be used, which are two things the RIBA are doing or have done. The first one is, this was a document I did for the RIBA, which is Embodied Whole Life Carbon for Architects. Whereas this is a sort of heavy technical thingy. This is understood by architects, including, so it's written as a sort of primer. Now, one of the important things in here is that it also refers to the project stages, so what should be done at each project stage. Now, following on from that, what the RIBA is doing, I'm chair of the RIBA Sustainable Futures Group, and the plan of work, which is the sort of what everybody uses as their point of reference for the stages of a construction project, is having a new sustainability overlay produced, which is in the process of being finalised. In fact, there's a session next week, a consultation, and there'll be further consultations. But the idea there is that these sorts of
something where we can work from, defined baseline materials, embodied carbon factors for doing the calculations, the measurements, so we're all on the same page. Even if it's not a perfect method, we have a sort of comparable result that we can all use for decision making. And we're already seeing environmental product declarations being used as a decision process in procurement. And it seems like a great platform to build on that. Rick's, I believe, mentions EPDs as the base as well, which is...
I think to sort of add to your question, I think how to reduce materials in buildings. I think one of the question, the way of rephrasing that slightly might be to say, how do you reduce the use of virgin material? Because if you're using recycled content, and that's by recycled content, I mean, there's no point in using recycled material for the sake of it. It's got to be efficient, more efficient than using something new. And by efficient, I mean environmentally efficient as well as financially efficient. So one way to do that is to reduce the incident of new material in buildings. I think the other way, which is a difficult one because there's no benefit to the person building the building, but is to encourage the ability of the building to be recycled later. So that means that it's capable of being dismantled in an easy and efficient way. The components can be recycled. So this is the circular economy, if you like. And it also means avoiding things like composite materials. And Julie, we were talking about the construction of the brickwork. It's absolutely right, because if you use, for example, soft mortar that can be taken off the bricks, it's obviously easier to reuse the brick than it is if you've got cement mortar, in which case the brick has only got one future life, and that's as rubble under a motorway kind of thing. So it is a complex sort of three-dimensional issue, if you like. But I think the idea of the circular economy, which is becoming more and more important, I think was raised earlier, is that in the RICS document there's Module D, which is about the benefits post the end of life, and actually encouraging building designers to create scenarios where a building is capable of being reused in its components, and you're not precluding that. And that, I think, will become increasingly important.
Thank you.
Navin, just before we move on to the next question, I just wondered if we could bring Jane in here, because Jane, you're involved in refurbishing buildings, I assume, with the Crown Estate, if you're involved in sustainability with the Crown Estate. And I just wondered if you had anything to add on these questions about, how we can reduce the carbon emissions of the materials being used in buildings if you're involved in refurbishment.
That's fine. I mean, we do a combination of both refurbishments and redevelopments, and we can very much talk about our experience from a central London context. I think I would echo a lot of what the panellists have said, in that I think collaboration is absolutely key, and the way that we've done it from our experiences, we've got our development sustainability principles, which is a corporate document, strategy document that applies to all of our developments, and that essentially sets out the process. And I think it is something that we have to look at on a case-by-case basis, what's appropriate for the particular scheme that we're looking at. And it's establishing that process to make sure that embodied carbon is considered as part of a number of factors. I think there's different things that you can do throughout the design and construction process which can help to reduce both the volume of building materials and embodied carbon. So if we're looking at the design stage, it's kind of the designing out waste principles, and then into the construction phase, looking at opportunities to collaborate with our supply chain to reduce it. And we have some good examples on some of our schemes where by applying that process and approach, we've been able to reduce embodied carbon.
How much of recycled materials do you reckon you use in your projects?
As I said, it's kind of assessed on a case-by-case basis.
Okay.
What we do have is recommendations within our development sustainability principles, which sets out recommendations on using EPDs, recycled content, but we're not prescriptive in terms of specific building materials because it has to be looked at on whatever is appropriate for that development.
Okay, my last question in this cluster of questions is about role of the mayor as well as boroughs. What do you think, how can the mayor best tackle embodied carbon in the London plan? And then role of the boroughs and how best mayor can support boroughs towards forwarding this agenda. So London plan and mayor's role, please.
I think we recognised that it was something that we needed to tackle in the London plan, and so the main policies that deal with it are the policy SI2 on greenhouse gas reduction, and also cutting across to our policy SI7 on circular economy. As previous speakers have said, we recognise that we've tackled operational emissions quite well today, and it's becoming more important to deal with the embodied emissions because it's becoming proportionally more significant. So we've made this, I think, important first step to bring in the principle of asking referable development, so the larger developments that the mayor sees, to start assessing their embodied emissions, so we can make a first step in gathering data about this. And I think that may lead on in future when we've got better data on this, to setting benchmarks and setting targets. But I think it's a really positive first step, and taken on board comments during the consultation from people around the table, and things like the RICS guidance that was published quite recently, in coming up with a positive way that developments in London can start to tackle this. So I think getting the principle in the London plan is the first step, and once we've got that through, obviously our focus is on the London plan and the upcoming examination in public, and then we'll start looking at developing guidance that can support developers and planners, both at the level of scheme we're talking about in the plan specifically, referable scale development, but also something that can filter down to smaller schemes and the kind of applications that the boroughs might see. So I think at the moment it's not a new principle, but it's quite, everyone's talked about possibly the lack of data. It's quite a new area. How do you set the boundaries of what you're measuring? And boroughs probably don't have a lot of resource to start dealing with this issue at the moment. So I think it's important to start with the big things and with developers and consultants who are maybe a few steps ahead, and start setting the agenda, start making designers, architects, developers bring this forward in their thinking, bring it into the design stage, and then with a view to it filtering down into
smaller schemes.
Do you think much is being done to forward the agenda through other policies as well as MEA's strategies? Because obviously, you know, there's a lot of overlap when you look at the policies within, you know, planning, regeneration. You got various other aspects, and that's where I think we can have a much stronger impact on getting the carbon friendly.
Yeah, I mean, I think it does fit well with other policies, like you said, on reducing waste, improving recycling. People maybe weren't thinking about it from a carbon angle, but this just brings that as another, you know, another part of the thinking, but it sits quite nicely with some of the other things that are happening.
Anybody, do you want to add anything?
Sorry. I know that Camden has actually quite a punchy bit on embodied and whole life carbon already in their policy, which I think was rewritten in June, or I forget. And I know Haringey are also moving up quite rapidly in that direction and trying to, you know, become much more holistic and are very pro the idea, for example, of embodied carbon, as I say, becoming another way of offsetting against Part L, you know, lean, clean and green. So I think, you know, that there's already a will out there.
Do you think Mayor can play a bigger role, better role, both, I mean, through London Plan, which is obviously being looked at, and soon, like has been mentioned, we have examination in public on that. So are there other policies, etc., that come to your mind immediately, or something that you would want the inspectors to look at to better sort of address these policies in the new London Plan?
I suppose it's always a question of wanting more, isn't it? I think, you know, as has been said, it's for referable schemes. It would be nice, you know, being idealistic, it would be nice if it was for all schemes. But, you know, I can see that things need to be step at a time. I can see that data does need to be collected. And I know that, you know, RICS is planning, they've bought the RAP database and they're supposedly going to be collecting it, data, although they claim funding issues, but that's another whole world. But so no, I think you know, I'm as I say, apart from always wanting more, I think actually where things are going now is good. Can we just come in for
Sorry, Julie wanted to come in.
It's a very small point to add. It's not more, but I think we could get much more out of the policy if there was guidance to boroughs, so that the assessments which are going to be asked in the draft plan are done so not only at the application stage, but also revised at completion of the building. Because these assessments are full of assumptions to no faults of design teams. There is just, in some cases, very little that is known at the application stage. So not only would the GLA have much better information, but also project teams would start to see the impact of their supply chain decisions. Sure. The classic example is where your granite comes from, China or not, etc. But I think that would be really powerful, and it's just a small tweak in the guidance.
I fully agree with that.
Robbie, you want?
I think that, so I mean, we're on the product stage, I suppose, also focusing on products. I think first point is there are a lot of standards out there already. There is a ISO standard for product carbon footprints, and ultimately a building is the sum or aggregation of multiple products. So I think there's a lot of stuff which we could already build on. I think what's lacking, particularly in I guess the UK, we're great at corporate level for having a framework and a methodology for assessing carbon at a sort of business level. There isn't a sort of consistent framework for calculating and reporting carbon at a product level, and I think RICS has made good progress with that, but what I'd like to see is BEIS, DEFRA encouraged to update the government conversion factors with embodied carbon factors that we are all using, like we very successfully do for transport and for electricity, to have a sort of go-to where we are all comparing like with like and can start to use it as a sort of tool for decision making. And I think the other thing is, you know, look at things like BREEAM, LEED, and the huge successes they've had for infrastructure. They've been market-driven drivers that have been very successful in getting manufacturers, developers to start thinking about low embodied carbon products and procurement. We literally get panicked phone calls at WSP from manufacturers of construction products going, I've been told if I don't get an EPD sorted and start looking at the embodied carbon in my product, it's not going to be included in the procurement list for this infrastructure project. So it's been a great catalyst for change, and there's no reason why we couldn't take those same principles to the built environment for buildings.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. I'm done.
Can I just come in on this? Can I come in on this question?
Yes, Nikki, but then I'm going to be bringing you in. So do you want to...
I'll just finish off on this one.
Okay, very good.
I just it's Robbie, is it? He's just spoken.
Robbie.
Are you saying that the RICS guidance isn't good enough on products?
I think the RICS guidance is great. It's been it's been a long time. It's been long overdue. I think. Correct me if I'm wrong, Simon, that we haven't got to the stage where there are consistent emission factors that we're all working from.
No, that's fair.
Is that the case, Simon?
Yeah. Yes, that's a fair point. I think it's improving very rapidly. As has been said, the instance of EPDs and also the gathering of data is improving that aspect of things, I think, relatively quickly. But the key thing about EPD, what the RICS document does, it gives you a kind of hierarchy of references. So you start off with the best, and then you get the second best, and so on. But the use of EPDs in accordance with, there's a standard out there to which they should all be 15804, which is a sister standard to the standard on which this is based. So there is an element of joined up thinking there for sure, and I think it's a question of maturity and gathering data.
Because I'm actually very disappointed that I've argued for embodied carbon, particularly around materials, to be included in our zero carbon target. But I'm understanding that that's only going to be about operational emissions and not about any of the non-regulated ones, correct? Have I got it right? And I wondered whether we couldn't, are you saying that we have to, how many years do we have to wait before we can actually include embodied carbon as part of our carbon target?
I would be keen to include it now, but it's really a question of, and I was suggesting that if there was a kind of a target level, which so if you're building a building, and you'd have to have different targets for different types of building, but if you have a target level for a building type, say housing, or say non-high-rise housing, then even if that target is not perfect, at least it actually means that people have to think about all the embodied carbon aspects of all the materials that go into collectively meeting a target level. So even if, so I think there may, that is the way around this, I suspect. In other words, you create an overall incentive to reduce the embodied carbon cost, because that allows the designer and the client to choose a combination of low carbon things at the outset or long life things which may not be necessarily that low carbon. Like a brick is not inherently a low carbon product because it takes a lot of energy to make a brick, but it lasts you forever. So, it is not a simple, this is a low carbon product, that's a high carbon product. It is the context in which it is used, which is also very important, how it is assembled, but also its life over which it is expected to live, and what happens at the end of it. We were also saying about bricks, if you use a soft mortar, you can take it off, you can reuse the brick. That aids the embodied carbon life cycle, if you like, of the brick. If you use cement mortar, then it glues itself to all the other bricks, and it can only be used at a much lower level, i.e., hardcore in foundations or something. So there are various bits and pieces that go up to making this, and I think in order to incentivize, my view is in order to incentivize overall reduction, you need the regulation and things like the London Plan identifying the fact that you need to record this information, you need to undertake the study, so that's a start. But I think then it's a question of setting levels, ideally to bring it down and put overall pressure on the combination of materials that make a building.
So do you think, I'm just trying to find, that was quite a lot of stuff to absorb. Are you saying that we could be doing it now? Are you saying we've got to get this data and refine it a bit before we can actually bring in some
personally,
target?
and I know people will disagree with me, but I think there's no harm in starting something now and evolving it. I mean, you know, if we look back to the first iteration of Rhian, it was a pretty crude instrument, but it's got more and more sophisticated over the years. But you know, you have to make a start. So I'd be in favour of making a start now with whatever's available and maturing it over the next however many years. But I think it would be good to get the ball rolling. You know, as a result.
I wonder if there's a response from GLA officers on this, or from Julie Godefroy.
Yeah.
I know Julie well.
Godefroy.
Can I add very briefly to the previous point, because I think I may have come across incorrectly, was that there is a lot of great work going on in embodied carbon for buildings. What the issue is, I think, is that so there are emission factors out there, often through things like environmental product declarations that we can all use. They're typically produced by industry. So you might have a large cement manufacturing company or a steel manufacturer who will produce an environmental product declaration for a ton of their product or a meter cubed of their product. We then tend to use those data to then calculate the impact of HS2, for example, when we're looking at trying to help reduce the embodied carbon through the various design cycles. What I was trying to say was it would be great to. There's a lot of data out there, so there might be 20, 30 different EPDs for concrete. What would be great is to agree the baseline that we're working from and the emission factors that we're all using. So we can all talk about a corporation's electricity consumption from an emissions point of view, and we can compare like with like because we're all working from the same data set. With embodied carbon, there's not yet sort of unanimous agreement as to which factors we should all be using, so we can compare like with like. So that was just really to get a bit of a steer, and I mean, I'm not sure where the opportunity would be to do that, but that would really help catalyse the market. So there's a bit of action already happening there with Bream and Lead driving the market, but it's still not like for like.
Do we need this like for like, Simon?
Well, I think we do ultimately, but I suppose the approach I'm suggesting is one where you aggregate it so that you're saying there is a level, whatever combination of materials that you're choosing.
I get it, yes, I get that.
Whatever combination is, you create a level and you say that combination has to be below that level if you want to get a credit on your 106.
So they could be waiting for different things.
Yeah.
I'm sure there's a time factor here, so I just wondered, I ought to give, I wonder what Rhiannon thought about this. Or,
yeah, I mean, I think we have made a really significant step towards this, bringing it, up the agenda. But I think there's very established ways of dealing with and calculating the operational emissions. And at the moment, I think we want this to be something complementary that sits alongside it. We want to bring industry and everyone else with us as we start to get this data and start to learn about it and establish benchmarks, understand what good is, and then that's something we can start to set targets against in the future. But
and then what? I mean, when will these targets be set?
Well, when we next review the London Plan.
Oh, that's another 10 years, isn't it?
Well, I don't think it will be 10 years. But
I want us to take this away and think if we can't do a bit better.
But obviously, we're in a position at the moment. Obviously, we've got the draft London Plan. We've made the minor suggested changes, which have to be minor, and they've taken on board, I think, to a very significant extent, the comments of people around the table. It's been quite well received, I think, so far. So I think we can take this as a really positive thing that we've got in the plan at the moment. But I understand your frustration that it doesn't perhaps go as far as you'd like.
Well, I think it sets back, not having embodied carbon targets sets back a whole range of things which are being explored in this meeting. But anyway,
Nikki,
all right, I'm going on.
But before you move on to it, I just want, in terms of wrapping up on the section we've just been dealing with, I just wanted to ask, this is national, but I think it is relevant. I understand there are sustainability standards, the scheme development standards, which are met by, or must be met, by affordable housing providers in order that they get grant funding from the Homes and Communities Agency. So this standard includes sustainability grading of materials using the BRE Green Guide system, which is based on life cycle assessments. So do you think it should be applied to private sector housing? We've heard, people saying we need some incentives. So if it applies in the public sector for housing, should it also apply to the private sector? Who wants to? Julie, you're smiling.
Yes.
So it often is anyway, in London, and in many boroughs there are set requirements. I think it is very useful also outside of London, where local authorities sometimes are less well resourced and less well equipped to actually check the implementation of their policy. So they are useful. Whether the BRE's Green Guide is the best tool, I think is outside of today's meeting.
Okay.
EPDs, I think, and the BRE increasingly refer to EPD. I think what is useful also with these tools is that they don't only look at carbon. Mm-hmm. So, they allow all these other environmental issues we have mentioned to be looked at in the selection of materials and processes, etc. And we shouldn't forget this, I think.
Okay. Simon,
I think the Green Guide is being, I think the BRE abandoning the Green Guide in favour of the new MAT 01 in
Right.
Rhian 2018.
But the principle of applying these standards to private sector as well as to public sector housing.
And the funny thing is the private sector just kind of gets on and does a lot of this without any legislation, and the reason often being, going back to a lot of what the panel said earlier, is cost. These are often win-win situations. It's almost incredible that they don't happen by default. They're saving money, they get great reputational benefits from doing it, it gives them positive PR, they can get a LEED excellent building. So I think a lot is happening there, but obviously the answer for me would be yes, I'd love to see everyone doing it.
If I could add one more thing.
Yeah.
In my experience, the private housing sector is not that interested in embodied and lifecycle carbon, for the very good reason that they don't have a great deal of interest until after the building's been finished, because they flog them off. And I think that's a mistake, because the whole point about the life cycle aspects is that you're producing a better, longer term, more durable product. So by taking a whole life view and enforcing that, I think you would encourage, or enforce, whatever you want to call the word, you would encourage a better product.
Yeah.
But I think, as been said, this is not necessarily meaning additional cost, because low embodied carbon tends to mean lower cost.
Lower cost, yeah. Thank you. I'm going to move us on to the next section of questions, which Nikki is going to lead on, which is looking at the construction stage and demolition.
Yes. Just with your indulgence, Chair, I think, having listened to this last debate, I think there could be something we could recommend, which is maybe I accept that we're on embodied carbon in products and buildings, but what we're talking about is looking at the data, getting consensus, bringing everyone on side. But we could set maybe even we could suggest it as an amendment to the plan, but obviously it's up to the Mayor to do that. But maybe we could set a date for a target, rather than waiting until there's a complete review or replacement London plan in 8-10 years' time. Maybe you could say, like in 4 years' time, maybe, or something. Just so set a target by which all this sorting out of the consensus building and the data refining can be done by. Anyway, it's a suggestion. My question is about construction demolition, as the Chair said. And I want to start by asking, and I'll sort of open it, see who wants to come in on it, in what ways and how can the construction demolition industry improve on its record on reducing carbon emissions? How could it improve? Anyone want to come in?
Shall I go at that?
Yes.
I think, well, firstly I would say that quite often we've found that some of the bigger contractors are already quite positive about this, because about this line of thinking, because it means improving the efficiency of the way they produce things, and it also, as I say, if they, for example, if they're producing things in a more efficient way, can reduce costs and reduce deliveries and so on. But I think in terms of construction, I think you really need a better understanding of, by designers, of what they're specifying in all aspects. So we were talking a little bit earlier about the nature of the materials, the choices, the way you choose to select materials, that you need to really understand not just the colour and the shape and so on, but you need to, and the cost. You need to understand the carbon cost of that, but you also need the ethical sourcing aspects, healthy materials. All of these things go together, and at the moment, they're not covered by the design. They're not of great interest to most building designers. I'm probably doing down a lot of people, but nevertheless, by and large, architects specifying products are interested in the visual performance, the structural performance, and so on. But I think that needs to broaden, and that needs to filter down and back down and up through the supply chain. So I think better linkage between the supply chain and the architects. Now, quite often what happens with design and build, which is a sort of favourite way of constructing at the moment, seems to be that the architect may design things to a certain point, and then the contractor takes over the detailed design. And that then leads through into procurement and so on. So there isn't that sort of interconnectivity. And I think, when you're designing a building, you really need to, at the earliest possible stage, engage with the supply chain and the construction processes so that you understand the implications of what you're doing in the fullest possible sense. And I don't think that's necessarily happening in the best way possible at the moment. As far as deconstruction goes, I think the issues around deconstruction need to be considered at design stage. So the ability of a building to be easily taken apart, shall we say, which also aids, of course, maintenance, but enables circular economy and reuse. So it is, again, thinking holistically about the life of a material right from its sourcing. And I was using an example of aluminium, which, if it's anodizing, it's got to be all virgin material. If it's powder coating, it can be recycled material. But that
is that linoleum?
Sorry?
Lino.
Aluminium.
Aluminium. Sorry, I missed
aluminium. Yeah,
so aluminium. Aluminium. Yes.
Yeah,
Okay.
if it's anodizing for consistency, you need virgin material. If it's powder coated, then you can have recycled content, which means the colour of the aluminium doesn't really matter. You're just painting the whole lot. So it's those sort of things that need to be better understood. And it's not just aluminium, it's all sorts of products and materials and processes and where they come from, what they're made of, and so on. And I think it's really, I think you have to bring it back to the design team, architects, engineers, to understand what their products, what the things they're specifying are made of. But they can best do that by better connection with the supply chain.
Right. So it's much more joined upness.
Yeah, and I think,
as you said, connectivity.
With the demolition, it's understanding,
disassembly.
at design stage, how you take your building to bits. I mean, I was talking to a developer literally 2 days ago, who was describing how they were building a building top up, but you build the core, then you hang everything off it. And I said, how do you take that building down? Because I happen to know there was this couple of buildings in the city that were really problematical to demolish because they were upside down construction. And she said, we just never considered that. So, people don't build buildings to think about how they come apart. And I think that is important and needs to be thought about, particularly in, our increasingly resource-concerned world that we live in. I don't know how many people know this, but the Ministry of Defence, two of its prime threats or strategic threats to the United Kingdom are climate change and resource depletion. So if the Ministry of Defence is on it, I think we should all be on it probably.
That's interesting. But then you were saying that speculative builders aren't likely to, or contractors aren't likely to think so much about the disassembly. That might be 30, 50 years
But that's where it comes back to incentivization with a bit of arm twisting. If you've got
exactly. Can I bring in other people? Anyone else want to comment on this? You might want to talk about other aspects too. I don't know, the sort of the transport side of it, or the energy, or the plant side of it.
Local sourcing. you know, reduces. I mean, again, sort of an example of something I know is they normally would have bought the cladding for their building. This is a building up near York, from Europe, because that's where you buy fancy cladding. But they've discovered, because they've decided to go local sourcing, that there was somebody not that far away who could actually do just as good a job, but because they weren't one of the big names, they just would get overlooked. So, you know, local sourcing has social benefits, embodied carbon benefits, and so on. So I think all these things all link together, which I think is really interesting. And the Social Value Act comes in as well in terms of reuse of materials and so on.
I think if I can jump in.
Thank you, Simon.
I did have something to say, but I sort of didn't want to. I think one of the big problems is ownership structure. So jumping onto the circular economy topic again, one of our recommendations at WSP is again looking at modular design. So it's the design for demolition, making sure buildings can be taken apart. But I think the challenge there, and one of the topics on the agenda was sort of barriers to adoption, is the complex structure in which buildings are owned. You know, you have a designer, developer who builds it, it then gets handed over to someone else who might have paid for it. You have a facilities manager, you have multi-occupancy, different tenants. And I think, like with the automotive industry, there's a movement towards leasing, and this is one of the key principles of circular economy. And when you've got that, the person who owns the materials, has ownership of that embodied carbon and the other impacts, sees that through the whole life cycle. And therefore, at the end of its life, maintenance, whatever it might be, they're able to monitor that and adapt it and ensure that good green principles are being applied. I think with buildings, if we started to move towards that structure, which we're seeing in other sectors, there would be someone who would be able to see that building through the whole life cycle. So they wouldn't just design it and then the person walks away and it's someone else's problem. It would be able to be moved the whole way through. And we're seeing this in London already, I think. Companies like WeWork and various other equivalents are buying up entire estates, and they do everything, and they have opportunities to trial and pilot things that are circular economy, low carbon, and if it works, to roll out across their entire estate. So I think it's ownership structure is a key thing, and it's having someone who is responsible from the construction stage right the way through to the end of life. And I think at the moment that's one of the big barriers.
That's very interesting. I mean, I was going to ask a later question about barriers, but that's very well. That is interesting, and also, not just the barrier, but one of the solutions is the leasing model.
The ownership. It's happening in every industry, mobile phones and cars. And the great thing there is that I, as a consumer, I don't want to own the materials that are in my vehicle or my washing machine or whatever it might be. They are complex materials that I don't know how to dispose of at the end of its life, and equally I don't know how to maintain or fix. So them keeping control of that means that as these things adapt, as better practice comes in, as we start to embed these sorts of principles into degrees and training, they can adapt in real time. And I think the principles apply very well to buildings and infrastructure.
Nick,
I could throw it.
Yes?
Sorry, could I just come in here? Because, Jane, you're from the Crown Estate, which obviously owns property. I'm just wondering about, just in relation to the ownership structures points that were just being made, whether you've got anything to contribute about whether that ownership makes it easier to think about these long-term issues around
embodied carbon.
Yeah.
I mean, as I mentioned before, we do have our development sustainability principles, and that means that we can set quite clear targets and requirements. We do consider embodied carbon as part of a number of other decision factors when we're looking at a development. In terms of the comment around ownership structures, what I would say within the construction, and this might be something to consider, is in the construction industry, it is quite complex and fragmented, and you're talking about very long supply chains. And I think when you have that kind of quite fragmented supply chain, I think that is one of the challenges that we've got, in addition to the fact that this is still an emerging area for the construction sector compared with other areas like operational carbon. So I think the challenge / opportunity is how do you harness all of the different parts of that supply chain, ensure that they're collaborating together so that you can actually deliver meaningful carbon reductions.
Thank you. Sorry, Nikki.
No, I just want, does anyone else want to come in on this?
On this particular point, no.
I could just throw something in on procurement, if that would be helpful.
Yeah.
I think what is also being experimented with sort of circular economic kind of, and of course low carbon emphasis, is different modes of procurement. So, for example, at the moment, the traditional procurement route would be to buy light fittings, and you specify, you know, the sort of fittings you want, and they get produced, and you tender them, and the people supplying them have an incentive to produce the cheapest fitting that will last at least a year before maintenance kicks in, and if you see where I'm going with that. But of course, if you just buy light, and it's happened in various ways, I mean, Schiphol Airport is a sort of often quoted example. If you just buy light, you say you want a certain light level at the desk level, and you go out to the industry and you say, that's what we want light for 20 years or whatever it is, then the industry is incentivized to produce a fitting instead of lasting a year, because that's the cheapest way they can make to sell it, to produce a longer lasting fitting, because it will then mean less maintenance and less trouble for them. So by buying, if you like, it's a bit like, it's the same concept as Uber or any of these, or Deliveroo, any of these things. You buy the, you don't buy, you buy a service rather than an object. And what that also does, it comes back to ownership and things like that, because of course the light fitting is not owned by you, the building owner, it's owned by the person supplying the light. And if it fails, they replace it or fix it or whatever it is. So I think there are new models of things coming forward of improving things like procurement and so on in and the whole process of construction. But of course, for that to bleed down into more sort of regular building is probably more complicated, I should think.
Some of are there others want to come in on this? Do if you want to. Although I just want to ask, you mentioned, Robbie, you mentioned off-site construction, and sorry, the planning committee has looked at this and done a report and made a lot of recommendations on this, and I'm just interested in how people around the horseshoe think that it helps reduce carbon emissions.
This is modular.
It's modular, off-site. I mean, it's got so many names, hasn't it? The mayor's name for it, which I think is a good one, is precision manufactured housing.
Yeah, it's. I think it's a kind of. I'm sort of going a little bit off piece here with an example or analogy. It's a kind of Henry Ford kind of example, I guess. If you're going to mass produce something, there is always, from a sort of process engineering point of view, more opportunities for efficiencies. And I think with modular construction, what you're looking at is you're mass producing the parts that ultimately go into the building, and therefore you can look at small tweaks which overall make a large difference. And it's been very effective. I think Germany's one of the examples that's normally used where modular building's been a very effective way of doing it, but it's also going back to, I think, the point Simon made, it allows it to be deconstructed at the end of its life. And if you can reuse something, each time you reuse it, you're effectively halving the embodied carbon because it's been used again, it's no longer a virgin material. So I think it is a very good way of doing it, but I haven't personally done a full life cycle assessment of it, so I couldn't comment on exactly which life cycle stage the benefits come from.
Jane, is modular construction used in your outfit?
So prefabrication, we have
factory-built homes, whatever.
We kind of can talk from our experiences, which is focused on commercial offices and retail predominantly, as opposed to large-scale residential developments. But within some of our developments in central London, we have examples of where we used prefabrication for some of our schemes. I think for our schemes, which is we're in an area that has heritage considerations, we do have to factor in what's appropriate for each of those schemes. And I think some of there are benefits that we recognise that prefabrication provides, whether it's around less waste on site and off site.
Waste on site, off site.
On site and off site due to efficiencies in manufacturing. Also less transport going to and from the site as well. But I think it's kind of looking at how does that tie in with some of the heritage things that we do take into consideration, and it just needs to be looked at in terms of how appropriately it can be applied depending on the type of development that you're doing. So large scale residential would be a good example of where Robbie, your example would kind of...
Sorry, I missed the last bit.
The large-scale residential type schemes, which we're not... we don't do as part of our work in Central London, would be a good example perhaps of where prefabrication would work on a very large scale.
And it's a really good point on the minimisation of waste, because if you design modular parts, you minimise things like offcuts and various other sort of oversized parts on site, which again is another contributor to embodied carbon. But I think one of the topics of this section was the construction itself, all the plant equipment, the logistics, everything that happens on site. And with modular construction, there are huge efficiencies in getting the materials to site, because you can design transport mechanisms that reflect the modular parts that are moving. But also, if you look at what's going on in China, they're building skyscrapers in weeks using modular construction, as opposed to years in the UK, which greatly reduces the amount of on-site plant activity during construction. So it's huge economies of scale, efficiencies to be gained. But that doesn't mean it's the only solution.
I think your point about plant is interesting too, because you don't have the plant on site, do you? When you have
as in, I mean, construction equipment for the actual...
Which is all very...
It's off-site, yeah.
Energy intensive.
And probably, again, this is probably an assumption, but I would assume we'd be moving to more electric than sort of gas if it's on site, which would also take advantage of the decarbonisation.
There's potential air quality
benefits there. So is that one of the ways you could improve?
So if you're looking at a product level, if you're manufacturing something in a facility, you could start to move your factory to be more dependent on electricity than gas and other fossil fuels, and that would allow that product to reduce its embodied carbon, because it's taking advantage of the decarbonisation of the grid itself. Okay.
Simon, do you want to come in here?
I would absolutely endorse what's been said. I think the construction industry is a difficult industry, and it works to very low margins and so on. And it's actually probably quite inefficient. And I think one of the things about modular construction is it raises the level of efficiency, because, of course, you're bringing various trades together under one roof. And the incidence of things like snagging and failure and errors in construction are clearly reduced in off-site construction, which has direct benefits in terms of embodied carbon, and not just at the point of construction, but over the life of the building. And inherent defects are, unless they're design defects, but construction defects are definitely going to be reduced.
Okay, I don't know whether anyone's got anything to say on this. Sorry, my voice is going. But are there any examples of emerging technologies that would be really helpful in relation to this topic?
Yeah.
Yep.
I think there are areas which at the moment are kind of interesting, but not yet sort of developed enough to be fully sort of carbon efficient, if you like. One of those is 3D printing, and people like Arabs have produced, knuckles of, well, the structural members come in which are 3D printed in metal, and there are other examples of ceramic and so on. But there's also use of robotics in construction, where very complex shapes can be produced actually very easily and efficiently. And I mean, even with this building, every sheet of glass in this building would have been pre-programmed and designed. And that's really, it's just an evolution of that. It's actually taking that further and further. So there is evolution. And I think clearly a lot of this is moving. I mean, for example, if you look at the demand for housing in this country and the available workforce, there's not enough people to build all the buildings that are required, particularly housing. And so things like off-site robotics, etc., will increase. But what is odd is that at the moment, the sort of examples like LNG have produced a factory up in the north, which was supposed to be online by now, and there's been problems, there. So, and Langer Walk have a factory near Ebb Street, I think. But for some reason, these haven't really picked up steam yet, and I think hopefully they will do, because it's not a sort of instant panacea. I think there are issues that people are trying to deal with to roll these things out more effectively. But and anyway, even if you do off-site construction, you quite often have to wrap them up with the skin on the outside. You know, you have to put the cladding on separately, or the brickwork, or whatever it is. So it's not necessarily all just...
Yes. Digitalisation generally, there's this building information management, there's a whole area of data. Isn't that going to make construction much more efficient?
It should do, yeah, absolutely.
And, so the way design and digitalisation meets manufacturing.
I think Julia...
Yeah, I think...
Yeah, do come in.
I think, yes, that was going to be my next point, that it's not so much about the technology, but also the information available. And that has been recommended in all sorts of areas, including the latest Hackett review. But having information in the building about what's there and how it's supposed to be maintained so that it's durable, how it's supposed to be dismantled, who can reuse it in the future. So BIM, etc., whichever way we want to call it. But that is certainly one exciting area. It was, interestingly, a lot of the feedback that CIBSI received from members was that maybe it's something the GLA could act somehow as a repository for, so that in new buildings you would almost have this database of who has what in the future, to create this network that things like RAP used to have, or used to say they would have, but obviously it's not quite there anymore. But to sort of have a mini start of a circular economy in London, to not see materials as waste anymore, but as a resource.
Be interesting if you think that's an initiative the GLA should take up, if you've sort of fleshed it out a bit maybe, and told us, and sent it in. Is there, I'm just thinking, we're talking about technologies. Is there anything else people want to raise?
I've got another one on technology, actually. You mentioned BIM, and there's a lot of work to create, I guess, sort of product passports for construction products. Taking things like environmental product declarations that were mentioned earlier, which is effectively all the material, environmental, water, all the various other environmental impacts against a ton of concrete or steel. Putting that alongside BIM, we're starting to see happen, which means that it can then be built into the sort of modelling of the actual building at design stage, and you can look at the not only operational but the embodied carbon of it. That's starting to work really well, and I'm on the international advisory board for the EPD system, and that's one of the things we're pushing there, is digitisation of this environmental data, so it's accessible to designers in real time. And then the other thing, which I'm glad I get to mention, is blockchain as well. Blockchain is becoming a fantastic tool.
What is blockchain?
At its heart, it's a digital ledger.
It's a what?
A digital ledger. So, like you'd use for finance purposes, to keep track of a financial ledger as it moves through a chain. But the applications are becoming really broad, and I know that it's starting to be trialled in the construction industry alongside things like BIM data. So it's basically making sure that if I have a whole lot of environmental and material data associated with a product, as it moves through my supply chain when I'm building my project, I know that data is accurate, it hasn't been tampered with, any accreditations it comes with are fully sort of traceable. So it's effectively building trust into the procurement process and sitting that alongside the data. So quite future quite future ready, but it's something which I know the government are looking at. I think they have a committee on blockchain.
Can I just ask, because sort of construction materials, it's about stuff and sort of cement and messy stuff, and the idea that you can get more trust about the sourcing of stuff with something quite as technological as a sort of blockchain process, with stuff that is physical, messy stuff on the ground that's actually handled by people who don't necessarily even use computers very much in their everyday work. I mean, is that tech really sort of able to come in and provide that assurance?
I think that's one of the really exciting things about it, is once it's in the blockchain, that data is able to travel sort of uncorrupted because of the complex process that it uses. So that bit is unhackable. But like you say, it's that getting it into a digitized asset. And that's key for us, because if we are looking at a building, we want to know that environmental data and all the other data is definitely what was there at the beginning of the value chain. So there's a whole niche market where people will start to be looking at how you get real world assets, timber, concrete, whatever it might be, into these digital ledgers. And I guess a good example is the Kimberley process for diamonds, where they are able to asset tag a physical asset, i.e. the diamond, with a unique tag which says whether it's conflict free and various other things. And what they're trying at the moment is move it using that same real world asset to digital asset to technology, and then moving that into something like a blockchain. And it's working quite well in quite a few industries. I know forestry, I think, are looking at it for timber. If you're sourcing FSC timber, how do you know that there hasn't been volume fraud in the supply chain? So it's things like that.
Food also.
With Walmart, I think it was
yeah, because you don't necessarily, well, if you don't want GM food, if you want to certify that it's GM free, so there's some really interesting use of blockchain around food as well.
To move on, we've gone from sublime in a way now to, so what are the barriers then? I mean, when you think of the construction industry and you think of construction and demolition, what are the barriers then to us moving forward? I mean, the Mayor wants to reduce waste. Have I got this right? He wants to reduce it to 90% of waste, that we only have about 10% left. Is that correct, officer? We want to reduce the amount of construction demolition waste.
Figure of 95% recycling.
95% recycling.
By 2020.
By 2020, okay. That's a very close target. And we're now at about 54%, is that right? Something like that.
I'm not sure.
So what are the barriers, anyway, to us doing better? You mentioned the ownership one.
Yeah, I think knowledge and education is a key thing. I think people, I suppose it's a question of what creates the circumstances to improve knowledge and education in something like this. And I guess that may be regulation or certainly some form of incentivization. But I think awareness needs to grow. It is growing quite quickly at the moment. I mean, as I think I mentioned to you, that I was with the Sterling Prize judges this week, and I was again the previous year, last year, advising on sustainability. And what is interesting is that even in just 1 year, the whole sort of recognition and understanding of embodied and whole life carbon has, there wasn't a single person this year who didn't really think about it or address it, or hadn't covered it in some way. Last year, I think it was probably, even just in that year, it was very different. And certainly I know in about 2014, only about 1 out of the 6 finalists. So I think people, if you take those as sort of the cream of the profession, supposedly, there is a quite a rapid take-up of knowledge and information, but that needs to spread, right through the whole industry, and that obviously takes time. I think the tools are probably there now to enable confidence and people to progress with confidence. I think EPDs are growing rapidly. Software is being developed by all sorts of people. So the ability to do these assessments and calculations is out there, and the methodologies I think are there. I think it's the gathering, as has been said already, the gathering of data and the information to verify things needs to be, needs to mature and grow. But it comes back to our earlier discussion here, which was that how do we get people to take this up? Do we have to just jump in and say, right, we're going to have a requirement of some sort, which then means that people have to start responding.
What would the requirement be?
Well, for example, in the latest iteration of BREEAM, Matter 1 is now requiring a lifecycle assessment and embodied carbon at the RIBA stage 2. So they're requiring an assessment to be done, which is a good start. But that but if you're not interested in doing a BREEAM rating, then you won't take that into account. Also, if you're not that interested in getting that many points, you just want to get very good or inadequate or whatever it is.
Okay, so we're back really to the previous
You're back
discussion.
to that, I think, unless anybody else has got a...
Are there ways then, I mean, anyone sort of jump in, but are there ways then that we can support the industry? I mean, you're saying that, is there another way, I mean, without requiring, what other ways? How can we hothouse this along?
If you don't, and we've covered that before, but I do think that the current policy wording is a very good start, because it asks for assessment and calculation. These could be disclosed. They would build skills among the industry. It's an incentive. I think that's the biggest barrier that I see at the moment. It's the lack of incentive. Why would people look at it? Because planners don't ask for it, building regulations don't ask for it, and many clients don't ask for it. While having that very policy, I'm really hopeful that I know you're very keen to have something happen now, but a policy like that, in a cycle of planning applications of 2 or 3 years, you can really develop a lot of capacity in the industry. And with it, I think the points we've mentioned before about looking at how, for example, an assessment varies from the early planning stage to the completion stage would, again, open the eyes of many people about the importance of these supply chain arrangements, of procurement,
So
of
you're
procedures on site.
What you're saying is it would help, because we are now talking about construction and demolition. Of course, there's a lot of embodied carbon involved in that, but you're saying that just the process is going to, of bringing everyone together and getting more data and so on, is really going to help.
Yes, I think so. I think there would be a lot more awareness, and I think we very briefly mentioned other policies that actually go along the same way, incidentally or not, but all the attention on air quality to move away from diesel generation and diesel equipment on site. This will make a massive difference to carbon, let alone local air quality. And waste, I think we've covered at length already. But yes, I think there are some policies that, again, are not labelled carbon, which...
I think Julie's point about an assessment at the end of the project is really important, because otherwise what will happen is you'll get some glowing embodied carbon assessment at stage 2 or 3 or whatever it is, early pre-construction stage. But then if if it goes out to design and build or whatever happens, that will all be just lost. And of course, if you're talking about the construction stage and the demolition stage, I think, building on what Julie said, I think you need to ensure that whatever brilliant things were assessed at stage 2 and 3 are delivered through the design, through the construction process, and are reviewed at completion.
Can I then ask, thank you for that, can I then ask our GLA officers, how is first the London plan and then any other, the strategy and so on, environment strategy, how are these providing the right drivers?
I think that what we've got in the London plan sets out the broad principle, and I think when we're getting onto the details of what is in an assessment, when do you do it, these kind of things, well then we'll have to look at producing guidance and probably working with...
Sorry to just jump in, but the point made by Julie and reinforced by Simon about assessments at the end, when the project's been built, because we all know, it's really important too for our zero carbon reduction targets, because who knows, first of all, most people don't know how to read the energy assessment, and then they don't know how to monitor it. But so is that something we can put in?
Potentially, I think we need to look at all the options for guidance, and I can't give you an answer as to what we would or wouldn't put in there at the moment, because I think we need to have a lot more discussions and do more research.
Sure. That's something you can come back to the committee on.
Yes, yeah. I mean, it's certainly something. Once we've got the London Plan examination, we know that we've got the policy principles there, but absolutely need to be looking at all the guidance that supports the plan, and this specifically, what form our guidance might take, because I know we've got existing pieces of guidance in various formats, so we need to have a look at that and look at what sits together.
Great, thank you. Nikki, I'm going to call a halt now to you and bring in Leonie, who is going to be looking at demolition, rebuilds, retrofit. How do you make those kind of decisions? So, Leonie, over to you.
But just before we move on to that, I mean, I was interested in, Robbie was talking about some international work that's being done in this, and I think if we're looking to make changes and to come up with useful guidance, I think pulling in what's being done internationally is really important, because there's literally no point in us reinventing the very proverbial wheel, whether that's a blockchain wheel or an old cart wheel or any other kind of wheel for that matter. Yes, so obviously over the years we've gone through phases where we've decided that there are buildings that we can't stand anymore, you know, back-to-backs around Glasgow, so we knocked all of those down and you know, we stuck up other buildings that since then we've now decided that we also don't like very much. We demolished the whole of Holly Street. Usually the decision-making process that is followed seems to be more about you know, the actual amount of carbon that's being emitted as a result of what people are doing in the buildings, because they're leaky old buildings and they're very inefficient. So the usual decision seems to be between well, you know, can we stick something all over it to make it more efficient, or should we just knock it down? Are any of you aware that in that decision-making process that the embodied carbon in the actual building has been considered as part of the matrix that has allowed us to make those decisions? I'm going to ask Julie to start with, actually, I think.
I am only aware of very few examples. Personally, as a consultant, it happened to be in Camden, and it was many years ago, unfortunately, before there was widely available guidance. And it was on a couple of very controversial projects where I think asking for embodied carbon comparison was the planner's attempt to find a reason not to knock down the building, to be quite blunt. And because there was no established methodology, it was extremely difficult to do a thorough assessment with confidence. We could basically get an assessment to say what we wanted. So this is from many years ago. I'm not aware of...
A long time ago, in a country far, far away called Camden, once upon a time, we did it a couple of times, but we didn't really have any kind of methodology. Have we moved on since then? And I can see Simon is waving. Then we're correct. Okay.
We've done a fair amount of work with Grosvenor, and those obviously, by and large, Victorian buildings, some Edwardian, some Georgian. And we have done a lot of retrofits to varying standards. So clearly, at a minimum, they obviously comply with whatever's required. But we have done some Enofit, which is the kind of passive house version of for refurbishing. And we've also done new builds of the same sort of typology. So, you know, building, put it bluntly, fake Victorian buildings to either passive house standard or indeed to high level. And doing a kind of, and I would accept that what I'm about to say is only limited to what we've done, and more work would need to be done on this. But certainly what we've reckon is that the benefit of the overall whole life cost, and this is looking over about 80, 90 years, that the whole life costs of refurbishing a building of the type I've described to a high standard and getting it to be more energy efficient is in overall terms better than knocking it down and building a brand new building to the same performance standards, for the very good reason that you've got the embodied cost that you're not having to spend. So to me that, and it sort of seems intuitively sensible, but I think it's got to be examined more carefully, clearly, as I said. But certainly the indications we've had is that it is definitely better to refurbish. Now, if the quality of the original building is diabolical, well then all bets are off. But if you've got a reasonable quality, and you know, frankly, Victorian buildings are not bad. If they've been going for 150 years, they've probably got another 100 years in them. You know, yeah, I think it is definitely better. And it comes back to my point, sorry, about using recycled content. After all, you're just reusing the whole building.
I'm really sorry, I've just got to interrupt us here for a formal thing because we have a member who has to leave, and I just have to run through some formal stuff and then we will, so that, because we'll then become inquirate. So can I ask the committee to note the discussion and the report and delegate authority to me as chair in consultation with party group leads to agree any output arising from the discussion?
Agree.
Thank you. To ask the committee to note the recent action taken by the chair under delegated authority in consultation with party group leads as stated in the agenda and note the appendices to this report.
Noted.
We haven't done the work programme yet, have we? We need to
So
do that.
Just run through those items.
So the Environment Committee work programme, item 8, the chair needs to ask the committee to consider how it will take forward the Assembly's opposition to the expansion of Heathrow Airport and note the letter sent to all London Members of Parliament in June 2018, urging them to vote against expansion in the House of Commons on the grounds of noise and air pollution attached at Appendix 1.
Noted.
Thank you. Agree to use the 2018 October meeting to discuss the environmental impacts of aviation, focusing on the issues of carbon emissions from aviation, in particular from the additional flights implied by Heathrow expansion and of local impacts of London City Airport operations, principally noise and air pollution as set out in paragraph 4.4 of the report.
Agreed.
Thank you. To use the November and December 2018 meeting slots to discuss cold and damp homes as set out in paragraph 4.6 of the report.
Agreed.
Thank you. And note the committee's current work as detailed in 4.2 to 4.3 and 4.6 to 4.10 of the report.
Agreed.
Thank you.
Noted.
I would also like to take this opportunity to put on the record the committee's thanks to Grace Loseby, the former Assistant Scrutiny Manager for Environment, for her work to support us on a wide range of scrutiny reviews. In particular, the parks and green spaces, plastic bottles, the circular economy, recycling collections, waste incineration, unflushable products, fatbergs and other water issues, supermarket use of plastic, and her contribution to the scrutiny of the London Environment Strategy, the London Plan, and mayoral delivery. Thank you, Grace. I also asked the committee to...
Can we all associate ourselves with those remarks?
Yes, would you like to agree to that? Thank you very much, everybody.
I was going to say we're all going to agree that, but I think it is an amazing list, so I think it was worth reading out.
Nikki, please hold on one moment. Also, to ask the committee to note the date of the next meeting scheduled for the 11th of October at 10 o'clock. So we can now continue with our discussion. So thank you very much, Nikki, for informally.
So I think that was really interesting where Simon had just got to, which is essentially saying that over the whole lifetime, if you take in the whole lifetime, that usually, I think you were saying, just to paraphrase you, that the taking the embodied carbon into consideration as well as the operational carbon that people produce whilst using the building, that it would probably in most circumstances, be better to go for refurb rather than demolition. Now that's sort of, I think, what Simon was saying fairly clearly, although all bets are off when we've got some, and then we have produced some really ghastly buildings, let's be frank. Those ones are worthy of demolition because they're probably impossible to live in any case for people and can't be made, you know, decent in terms of heating and dampness and all the rest of it. Would anyone disagree generally though with the overall thrust of what Simon has said, that refurb is probably in most cases going to be better in terms of overall carbon? Does anyone want to fight, arm wrestle Simon on that point? Not literally.
I think there is really not much data to be... I would like to think so, particularly when we're talking about a heritage estate.
Yes. But that also then speaks to Simon's other point, which is that we need to do more in terms of starting to gather the data so that we're in a much stronger position to actually answer that kind of question. And is that something that the GLA can really start to help sort of push everything forward in that area so that, you know, WSP and other companies are available that operate in that space are all working from a level playing field and everyone knows that they need to do more in this area? Can I pose that to both Rhian and Anne-Marie?
I mean, I guess the new London Plan policy will apply to major refurbs as well in terms of the requirement for a whole life cycle assessment. We don't see too many of them. I think they more happen at the non-referable level, so we're not going to gather a huge amount of data through that process. So yeah, it might need to be something that we...
I mean, is it something, I mean, I know the Mayor's introduced his, guidance, good practice guidance on his balloting residents who live on estates about whether they'd like them to be demolished or not. Is it time for us to have good practice guidance on, full life cycle assessment of buildings before you even get to the point of thinking about balloting the residents? Is that where we should be? In terms of carbon, we're talking about, the overall picture in terms of, if the Mayor's to achieve the goal, which, I had Bentsy's ear about before he was even elected, about making London a zero carbon city. So it's something I feel very passionately about, and I know Caroline does as well. Isn't that something that we should be requiring people to do?
I think it's a reasonable consideration. I think the difficulty with those large sites, and you're talking about large-scale estate regeneration type schemes, is there's a whole host of different considerations going on there. Where densities are upping dramatically, it'll depend on the state of the buildings. It'll depend on a whole host of things. But I think it's something that is well worth considering as part of that. Multitude of things.
I think the point that worries me is that it's not actually even being considered as one of a multiplicity of issues at the moment, and I can see that Julie is nodding. I mean, for example, I've got a very large estate, some of which is actually architecturally fantastic, in Roehampton, and there's a number of sort of beautiful slab blocks that appear to float above the ground, modelled on Le Corbusier, so on and so forth. There's also a number of other buildings that are pretty horrible, not very nice to live in, and there's a need to increase density, but people are saying, well, do we need to do it by doing a full demolition of all of these different parts and then rebuilding everything? Or could we actually do it, for example, by, building floors on top of what's already there? And of course, that would probably then meet the, reducing the overall carbon in a way that the demolition clearly won't. I mean, is that something that's being brought into consideration?
I think on sites like that, the new policy would start to apply. So I think, the steps we've taken in the New London Plan will start to get that brought into the agenda. But I think it's going to be very site-specific. We've got listed buildings and all sorts of other considerations on those specific sites, and how, if you want to build on top, how much can you get away with? What is the existing structure? So I think it's all going to be quite site-specific, really.
Sorry, Julie, you want to come in?
Yes, may I add that leaving aside embodied carbon for a minute, generally the GLA's carbon policy, although I understand directly from working with the GLA that the policy is on operational carbon is meant to apply to major development, whether it's new build or substantial retrofit. However, in practice, it is very inconsistently applied in retrofit. And obviously, it's more complicated in retrofit, but many projects literally strip down the building to the floors and a little bit of the structure. So there is really little justification for not meeting the operational carbon policy. And I'm not sure this is clear at the borough level that the policy applies. And there are really big opportunities for making much more out of these major retrofits on operational carbon terms. I know it's an aside, but it's a recurring problem that we have seen for many years. The policy is interpreted as new build only.
I mean, I know retrofit's not really your sort of major business, Robbie, at WSP, but I'm sure you've got views on this, because I know you've got a number of people who work in the sustainability team globally.
Yeah, it's totaling almost 6,000 now. It's growing quickly.
Yes.
I think we do a lot of whole life cycle assessment for buildings, also for infrastructure. So there is a lot of activity in that space. Probably our biggest project there at the moment is HS2, and we're working with them to try and show a 30% reduction between scheme design and detailed design, and that's very much looking at embodied carbon of the construction. We do a lot similar things for buildings driven by LEED version 4 BREEAM, and that again is typically for new builds because they want to get that certification, but also because if they're building from scratch, there's often a lot of market drivers beyond the frameworks and sort of guidance that's already out there. I think with retrofitting, I did a bit of research before this, and a good example I thought I'd draw on the UN, and they did a retrospective study where they demolished their building, replaced it with a similar size one, much more efficient, and they found that it had a payback between 35 to 70 years before those new operational efficiencies outweighed the kind of capital carbon cost. So it does very much look, especially with the grid decarbonising, like it is heading towards that trend of embodied carbon being the big thing and retrofitting being the better. But then London is a very complicated city with lots of varying infrastructure of different time periods and builds and warehouses and various other things. And so I think what I'd probably like to see is something, even if it's just for a limited amount of time, that if a building or structure is going to be demolished, that triggers an assessment of demolished versus the proposed retrofit, just to sort of see what that's going to look like. Because I think retrofit's quite a broad subject. I mean, it could be, I don't know where you draw the line, but if you keep the facade of a building and kind of build almost a new building behind, is that a retrofit or is that a demolish? So I think to look at what is actually being proposed, and I'm sure there are cases where retrofits could be done very inefficiently, using quite poor materials and designed quite badly. So I think for a year or 2 years to actually just see what it looks like for London's specific housing stock would be really interesting. But I feel that it is leaning towards retrofit is better where possible.
Might be the point at which I'm just going to bring in Jane actually, because I know that you've been obviously working a lot on the Crown Estate. So this whole point about how do you make that decision, and how have you done that assessment of what the payback period is? Because I think you've probably gone more towards the retrofit than the demolish for very obvious reasons.
Yeah, and we've got quite an extensive sustainability program which is aimed at reducing overall carbon emissions. That comprises new developments, but it does comprise refurbishments as well as retrofit. And as a long-term landowner and owning quite an extensive part of the West End, we have been doing quite an extensive amount of work in terms of the refurbishments to make sure that the existing buildings that we have are performing as efficient as possible. So we've got a program in place that looks at that. When we're looking at refurbishments and or developments, we do have to consider quite a range of different factors, of which embodied carbon is one. We do have an example of where we decided to do a refurbishment of a building. We decided to retain the building services for that particular building because it was considered that, and it was also from a cost point of view as much as an embodied carbon. It was felt that that building would be able to run efficiently. And at the same time, it would be able to operate in that same way for another 10 years. So we decided to make that decision to not change the building services, but we've done other things to make sure that the building continues to perform efficiently. So we have examples of where we are ensuring that it's integrated as part of that decision-making process.
That would be quite interesting. I don't know whether you've got anything that you would be able to share with us about how you've made those decisions, and I'm quite interested in the UN example as well. That's actually quite a range of time, isn't it? Payback at 35 years or 70 years.
I've not looked into it in detail, but I would imagine it might be something to do with the decarbonisation assumptions for the grid they've looked at, but that's just my theory.
Yes. But if you have got anything that you can share with us, that would be really... Sorry, Simon, I think you wanted to come in.
I'm just going to really endorse what Robbie was saying. I completely agree that that should be a starting point of assessing what you can reuse, structural frame, whatever there is. And it's particularly in London where the quite often height constraint is really not that problematic. And I know economics might drive it, but I still think as a carbon perspective it would be a good thing to do.
Do you think anyone's done any kind of estimate of how much of London should be sort of left as it is, retrofitted or completely replaced? That's not the kind of assessment that anyone's done. I mean, you were saying London's very complicated and difficult.
Probably not since Rhian, I didn't.
But just very quickly, if I can, building on Simon's point, I think it's a very key circular economy principle, which is collaboration. And we've seen examples where it's happened, almost by accident, where major projects in London have collaborated and materials on a large scale have been reused. And there's a side piece to this of making sure we redefine construction waste as resource unless it's hazardous. But I think one of the key things is making sure these projects, from buildings to major things like Tideway and H2, are talking to each other. You know, why can't one building's excavated material become another's infill? Why can't a building that is going to be demolished, if it's all safe to do so, why can't those materials be used to build another? And I think if we can get a collaboration network in London with all these designers, developers, building owners talking to each other, but also sharing best practice as well, you know, where have things worked, and people love a good success story, particularly if it saves money.
Interestingly enough, as part of one of the reports that we were just referring to that Grace Lesby was very helpful with, we conducted a visit with her to a company that deals with construction and demolition waste and repackages it all and reuses just about everything. Some of it gets used here, some of it actually gets sent abroad, and it was quite astonishing that you know, the amount of material, almost nothing was wasted from the building sites. On the other hand, they did also point out that on building sites in this country, an awful lot of things are wasted because we're unbelievably careless, whereas if you went to Japanese building sites, the number of pallets or the number of broken pieces of plasterboard would be almost zero because people are incredibly careful in the actual construction processes. So it was quite instructive talking to them about that point, but a lot of it I think may well be being used. That company was called Power Day, for information. So we're in a position where you think that because of the decarbonisation of the grid, that we can end up with buildings now that can be so efficient over the whole of their life cycle that they can be completely zero emission. Obviously, there are some that might even be net zero or actually contributing back if they're completely covered in terms of new build, where they're contributing back to the grid.
I was looking at a study done by some Norwegians on the sort of, it was really aimed at the circular economy thinking, but it was to do with decarbonisation of the grid. And in essence, what they were looking at was and this was all materials, so it wasn't just building materials, but it certainly applies to building materials. And what they were looking at was if you were to, if you like, produce materials, whether it's for buildings or food or whatever it was, from zero carbon energy, you would still have a significant carbon emissions. And the reason for this is because of the way a lot of products are produced. So even if, as I say, you've got sort of zero carbon energy feeding into making them, just the process of extracting things and turning them into materials, to the extent that if you have a budget to the end of the century for the sort of gigatons of carbon allowable for materials to stay within 2 degrees, that would be, I think it's 300 gigatons to the end of the century. And even with zero carbon energy, the materials would use up 600 gigatons. So materials remain a problem, even with manufacturing being very, efficient and zero carbon. So that then leads us straight into, reuse, recovery, recycling, and all the rest of it to bring that down.
Interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I just ask, new build is zero rated for VAT, and refurbishment obviously pays VAT at 20%. So do you think this is a big factor in the way people make their decisions about whether to refurbish or demolish and start from scratch?
Yeah.
So obviously that goes beyond what the mayor can do. It's a national thing, but you.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, if it's listed, then there's another issue kicks in. But yeah. I mean.
Julie, did you want to?
Yes, I mean that's a recurring industry issue. I think also it depends on who the people who decide are. I think if we look at homeowners or individual homes, it's very different. I think there are a lot of studies that show that even if there were longer-term energy savings, etc., there are many other factors why people don't retrofit. So hassle, mistrust in builders, etc., etc. I think we are not necessarily
although cutting the cost by a fifth might well encourage people to
yes,
make those investments into retrofitting their homes to make them more energy efficient.
Possibly. It seems, certainly for individual homeowners, which are a little bit outside the remit of this policy, it seems we have to address other things to do with behaviours, comfort, maybe showing the co-benefits, which are not, we do not necessarily behave financially rationally. There are all sorts of other reasons why retrofit doesn't. But yes, in terms of the wider industry, that seems
an issue.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm going to wrap up now, but I just wonder if each of you would like to make any suggestions on how the Mayor could best tackle embodied carbon in the London Plan and his other policies. So is there something that you think the Mayor could be doing to tackle this issue? Simon, can I start with you?
I think we've probably covered most of the issues, to be quite honest. I think
But if you were going to be asked for one thing that we've covered during the meeting, what would you ask the Mayor to do?
I would reassess at the end of the project.
Great, thank you. And Jane?
It's a good question. I mean, in our opinion, we welcome the revisions that were made in the London Plan, but perhaps aside from policy, the GLA might have a role in convening different parts of the supply chain to better understand embodied carbon.
Thank you. Robbie, one thing that would be good? Or two?
I wrote down a couple of things. I think the requirement for the retrofit assessment triggered by demolition, I think is quite a good point, because I don't think it's clear how far retrofits go sometimes, so that would be really useful. And I think some leadership from London, in terms of best practice, collaboration, and sort of guidance to help us all see what the best practice is. But something which we're really passionate about WSP, so we're happy to keep helping in the journey.
Thank you. And Julie?
Someone has stolen my reassess.
We'll re-emphasise.
Disclosure, I guess. Disclosure of information, and it could be anonymous, but showing what's out there, good and bad examples. I think just, public information.
And Rhian and Anne-Marie, is there anything that you have taken out of all the brilliant evidence we've heard this afternoon that you're going to take away?
Yeah, I think the whole thing's been really useful for us to hear. I mean, I know we've had previous discussions, certainly with Simon before, and engagement with other groups, but I think this continuing to have these kind of discussions will be useful when we are developing the guidance. So I'm looking to keep up contact with you.
Brilliant.
And certainly I think the issue around sort of what gets agreed at planning, making sure that happens in practice, is something we definitely want to move towards. That's why we have a new monitoring requirement in the new London Plan. So, looking at whether the whole life cycle assessment can become part of that, I think, something we can take away.
Well, thank you, all of you, for your time and your thoughtful contributions. It's been a really, really interesting session. I'm sorry about the musical chairs. And I think that draws us to a close. Okay.